A lady sells her supposed fiancé to a wealthy woman for 40 million Naira. What a shocker. Will she ever regret her decision? This movie is packed with valuable lessons, and if you think you've seen it before, what you're about to hear will surely surprise you. Grab your popcorn and let's dive in. Hey guys, welcome to my amazing channel. Today, we'll be exploring another captivating and popular Nigerian movie by Maurice Sam TV. Stay tuned so you don't miss out on the twists, turns, and all the fun in this story. The movie begins with Steve and Anita. Steve was preparing for work while Anita complained about his clothes, saying they needed to buy new ones. Steve replied that he was fine with what he had since, as a mechanic, they'd still get dirty. They laughed and played around, then decided to eat bananas together. On their way out, Anita escorted Steve, and they ran into Anita's friend, who ignored Steve's greeting. Afterward, Anita's friend scolded her for spending her money to support Steve, even contributing to the banana purchase. But Anita defended her boyfriend, saying she loved him and believed things would get better soon. Later, as Steve continued working, he spent the evening talking to Anita about his struggles and how he felt inadequate because he couldn't provide for her. Anita reassured him, saying she wasn't complaining. The next morning, Steve was splashed with water by a car while heading out. The driver, Cheryl, immediately got out to apologize. Steve said it was fine since she was courteous enough to stop and apologize. Cheryl, appearing lost, asked for help with directions. Steve offered assistance by checking her address and pointing her in the right direction. Grateful, Cheryl tried giving him money as a token of appreciation. Steve initially declined, but Cheryl insisted, saying it was from her heart. When Steve got home, he showed the money to Anita, and they were thrilled by the unexpected windfall. Anita suggested he call Cheryl to thank her, but Steve refused. Undeterred, Anita kept trying to convince him. Eventually, they split the money, and Anita went off to cook. The following morning, Anita was seen persuading Steve to call Cheryl, saying it was only to express gratitude. After much persistence, Steve gave in and made the call. Cheryl graciously agreed to meet him in the evening and shared her address. Anita, excited about the opportunity, prepared an outfit for Steve and dismissed her friend's continued criticism of Steve. This time, she firmly warned her friend to respect her choices and stop belittling her man. Steve met Cheryl at an expensive restaurant, feeling a bit out of place. Cheryl reassured him, saying she would handle the bill. During their conversation, Cheryl learned that Steve was well-educated, graduating with a first-class degree. She was impressed by his intelligence and baffled that he hadn't secured a job yet. Cheryl promised to discuss his situation with her father and requested his CV to speed things up. They reintroduced themselves formally before Cheryl offered to drop Steve at home. He declined, saying he had errands to run, but she insisted on giving him money again, which he reluctantly accepted. Back home, Anita was overjoyed to see another 100,000 Naira from Cheryl. This sparked an idea in her head. When Steve asked what she was thinking, Anita suggested he make Cheryl fall in love with him as their ticket to more wealth. Steve refused, but Anita, being manipulative, persisted in highlighting the potential benefits until Steve reluctantly agreed. Anita began researching Cheryl with help from her friend, discovering that Cheryl was popular and wealthy, details that heightened Anita's interest. Later that night, Cheryl called Steve to thank him for meeting her and informed him that her father seemed impressed after their discussion. She reiterated the need for his CV and arranged to meet him the next day. Steve was thrilled and shared the update with Anita, who encouraged him to make the most of the opportunity. The next morning, Anita pushed Steve to request a large sum of money from Cheryl, arguing it was pointless to keep accepting small amounts. Steve disagreed, calling it exploitative. But once again, Anita convinced him. Steve handed over his CV during his meeting with Cheryl, who was amazed by his qualifications. She empathized with his struggles and promised to secure him a position at her father's company. Their conversation turned personal, with Cheryl sharing how she lost her mother and worked hard to make her father proud. Steve talked about his humble beginnings with his mother in the village. Cheryl admired Steve's resilience and intelligence, saying he didn't seem like someone who had been through so much. When Cheryl offered to drop Steve home, he accepted this time. Once home, Steve told Anita about Cheryl's plan to help him secure a job and how she invited him to visit her after work. Anita was ecstatic, urging Steve to clean up and look his best before meeting Cheryl. However, Steve got a call to fix a car that had broken down. It turned out to be Cheryl's car. Surprised to see him, Cheryl learned that being a mechanic was one of Steve's main jobs. She expressed disappointment, saying he deserved better. Cheryl then invited Steve to spend the rest of the day with her and promised to pay him for his time. Steve agreed, and they both went to Cheryl's house. At Cheryl's house, she cooked a meal for Steve and admitted she wasn't very good at cooking. They laughed and talked, enjoying each other's company. Suddenly, Steve's phone rang, but he chose not to answer. When Cheryl asked about it, he said it wasn't important and he'd return the call later. Meanwhile, Anita was worried because she hadn't heard from Steve. During their time together, Cheryl mentioned wanting to show Steve something, but when she returned, she seemed disappointed, saying her sister had taken their photo album, so she couldn't show it to him. Steve reassured her that it was fine. They then discussed their experiences, both the good and the bad life had brought them. Cheryl confided that she didn't have many friends because people were only interested in what they could get from her. This struck a nerve with Steve, who realized he was also taking advantage of her. He apologized, and they shared a smile. When Steve returned home, Anita expressed her worry, asking where he'd been. He told her he was at Cheryl's house. She questioned why he went dressed so casually, but Steve brushed it off, saying it was a long story. Then Anita asked how much money he got, and Steve said he received 100,000 Naira. Overjoyed, Anita told him she had been right about Cheryl, but Steve expressed guilt, saying Cheryl was a good person who didn't deserve to be used. Later that night, Cheryl called Steve to thank him for spending time with her, saying he was a perfect man. Steve complimented her as well. Cheryl admitted she wanted to see him more often, even after his work hours, and Steve agreed. The next day, Cheryl shared everything that happened at her office while Steve listened and laughed. They clearly enjoyed each other's company. Afterward, Cheryl invited Steve to her house. While there, Steve played games while Cheryl worked on some documents. She fell asleep, and as Steve tried to move her to the couch and leave, she held his hand and asked him to stay. Steve stayed and found himself staring at her as she slept. Another day, Cheryl showed Steve confidential documents related to work. When Steve asked why, Cheryl said these were tasks he'd handle once he got the job. Cheryl then confessed her feelings for Steve and told him to think about it, but she also wanted him to take her to his house. Reluctantly, Steve agreed. At home, Steve lashed out at Anita, saying Cheryl had fallen for him and he wasn't comfortable with it. He also mentioned Cheryl's request to visit his house. Anita, however, saw this as progress and reassured Steve that their plan was working. Once again, she sweet-talked him into suppressing his guilt. The next day, Cheryl visited Steve's house, where Anita posed as his younger sister. Anita was overly friendly, praising Cheryl and making her feel welcome. Cheryl complimented Anita's beauty, and the two got along well, leaving Steve surprised at Anita's ability to pretend so convincingly. Later, Cheryl invited Anita to her house and gifted her expensive clothes, hair products, and accessories. Anita was thrilled and flaunted her new items to Steve, declaring this was the life she'd always dreamed of. Steve, however, was visibly upset, saying he couldn't continue with the plan. Anita dismissed his concerns, saying Cheryl might want to kiss him eventually, but as long as they didn't go too far, it was fine. Steve disagreed, but Anita refused to let him back out. One day, while Steve and Cheryl were together, Steve seemed distant. Cheryl asked if he was bothered by her confession of love, but Steve said no. It was because his mother was sick and needed surgery, and he couldn't afford it. Cheryl asked how much the operation would cost, and when Steve said 1.6 million Naira, she immediately offered to transfer the money. Despite Steve's protests, Cheryl transferred 3 million Naira to him, leaving him shocked. Steve thanked her profusely, but Cheryl assured him it was nothing, as she couldn't bear to see him struggle. Overwhelmed, Steve hugged her before leaving. The next day, Cheryl visited Steve, and Anita prepared a meal for her. Cheryl offered to feed Steve, but he initially refused until Anita pressured him. Afterward, Steve excused himself to sit in the living room while Anita and Cheryl continued chatting. Anita boasted about the dishes she'd prepare for Cheryl on her next visit. Later, in Cheryl's car, she asked Steve about his mother's health. Momentarily forgetting his lie, Steve replied that she was fine. He then gifted Cheryl a piece of jewelry, explaining that it wasn't expensive but hoped she would like it. Cheryl was delighted and promised to cherish it. That evening, they went to a restaurant for drinks. When a staff member accidentally spilled wine, Cheryl graciously said it was fine and offered to pay for it. Her kindness left Steve increasingly amazed. Afterward, Steve took Cheryl home, and though she was drunk, she didn't want him to leave. They ended up sharing a kiss. Once Cheryl fell asleep, Steve left and returned home, where Anita was waiting for him. Anita tried to kiss and seduce Steve, but he pushed her away, saying he wasn't in the mood. Hurt, Anita complained about being ignored, but Steve begged her to stay, and she reluctantly agreed. The next day at Cheryl's place, she and Steve talked in the kitchen about their cooking skills, sharing a happy moment. Cheryl once again confessed her love for Steve, and this time, he responded by saying he loved her too. Later that night, Cheryl called her father, telling him she had stopped by earlier when he wasn't home. She mentioned wanting to discuss the guy she had recently started seeing. At Anita's home, her friend remarked that she had been wondering where they got all the money from. She also warned Anita to be careful, as what they were doing amounted to fraud. The friend added that they should have upgraded their living conditions by now, and Anita agreed. Later, Anita went to Steve's place and suggested they move into a better house. Steve became furious, saying he had taken enough money from Cheryl and couldn't continue. Anita was displeased, but Steve stood his ground, insisting he couldn't treat Cheryl that way anymore. That night, Steve called Cheryl, telling her he had something important to discuss with her the next day. The following day, Anita tried to talk to Steve, but he was still upset about the previous conversation. She kept urging him to reconsider asking Cheryl for more money. After a long argument, Anita attempted to seduce him, kissing him passionately. At that moment, Cheryl walked in and saw them. Furious and heartbroken, she left immediately. Steve followed her, but she wouldn't listen. When he returned home, Anita blamed him for everything, asking what they should do next. Steve finally admitted to Anita that he had fallen in love with Cheryl. At first, Anita thought he was joking, but when he repeated it, her anger exploded. She began hitting him, asking how he could betray her. At Cheryl's place, she cried, feeling devastated by what she had witnessed. Meanwhile, Anita broke down in tears as she confided in her friend, expressing disbelief at how quickly Steve had fallen for Cheryl. Her friend consoled her, advising her to forget about him and move on. Steve went to Cheryl's house to explain, but she slammed the door in his face. The next day, Anita confronted Steve, asking why he hadn't called her since their argument. Steve apologized, but made it clear that he no longer loved her. He accused her of being too money-focused and said she might even sell him out if it benefited her. Anita, hurt and angry, claimed that everything she did was because she loved him, but admitted she had gone too far. Before leaving, she warned Steve that if she couldn't have him, no one else would. Steve continued visiting Cheryl, but she repeatedly refused to see him, still heartbroken. He tried explaining himself, but to no avail. Cheryl called her father and confided in him, saying she couldn't stop thinking about Steve and still loved him despite everything. The next day, Cheryl went to Steve's house. She told him she deserved to know the truth. Steve confessed everything, apologizing and admitting that he truly loved her. He explained that he hadn't been able to focus or function without her. Cheryl asked about his other girlfriend, Anita, and Steve reassured her that his feelings for Cheryl were genuine and that he couldn't be with Anita. Moved by his sincerity, Cheryl forgave him, but warned him never to break her heart again. Steve promised to prove his love, asking for a second chance, and Cheryl agreed. 3 months later, Cheryl and Steve were at their favorite restaurant, happily discussing their upcoming marriage. Cheryl mentioned that her father was still head of his department, but their joyful mood shifted when Anita unexpectedly walked in. She approached Steve, reminding him of her earlier warning that if she couldn't have him, no one else would. She handed him an envelope, saying she was leaving the country with her fiancé the next day. Cheryl smiled after Anita left, which puzzled Steve. He asked Cheryl why she was so calm, and she revealed that she had already sorted things out with Anita. A flashback showed Cheryl meeting Anita to discuss their situation. Anita accused Cheryl of stealing her man, but Cheryl clarified that Anita had introduced herself as Steve's sister. Cheryl then asked Anita what kind of business she would like to start. At first, Anita refused any help, but she quickly changed her mind, asking Cheryl how much she was willing to give. Cheryl offered her 40 million Naira. Back in the present, Steve was shocked when Cheryl told him the amount. He joked, asking if Cheryl's family printed money. Steve expressed disappointment in Anita, saying she had always prioritized money over everything, which was why she chose it over him. Cheryl comforted him, saying it didn't matter anymore because they had each other and would be together forever. The couple shared heartfelt words about their love for one another, reflecting on how it had overcome all challenges. Some love stories happen unexpectedly and face difficult trials, but true love always finds a way to survive. Playing with someone's heart is never the right thing to do. Being honest and genuine often leads to better outcomes. True love endures trials, but only the strongest bonds can pass the test. Closing message. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to this amazing channel for more captivating, inspiring, and educative Nigerian movies. See you next time.